Hey everyone, so in this video we are going to be going over how to construct the standard form equation of a circle. So if this is something you struggle with, keep watching. Alright guys, so let's start by going over what the standard form equation of a circle is. So the standard form equation of a circle is denoted as x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equal to r squared. So you're probably wondering, okay, what do all these variables represent in this equation? So let's start by going over what the h and k represent. So essentially the h and k represent the center coordinate of our circle. And basically the h represents the x coordinate of the center and the k represents the y coordinate of our center. Now the r in this case, in this equation, represents the radius of our circle. And essentially, remember, the radius is going to be basically a line segment in our circle that starts from the center and extends to one of the circle's endpoints. So essentially in this video, we're going to be going over several examples where we're given some details regarding the circle, and essentially what we have to do is use those details to construct the standard form equation of that circle. So let's jump into our first example. Alright guys, so for our first example, we're given that the center of this circle is -4, -3, and we're also given that the radius of the circle is 5. So in order to construct the standard form equation of the circle, we need the center and radius, and luckily for this example, we're given both the center and radius. So all we really need to do is just plug in everything. So remember that our equation is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equal to r squared. So essentially we're going to plug in our center into the h and k and our radius into the r. So we'll plug in the -4 into our h, the -3 into our k, and the 5 into our r. And when we do that, we get x minus a -4 squared plus y minus a -3 squared equal to 5 squared. So what we can do is just clean this up. So x minus a -4 squared will turn into x plus 4 squared, because remember, when you subtract a negative, that turns positive. So also when we have at y minus a -3 squared, and once again that'll turn into y plus 3 squared. And then lastly, 5 squared is going to be 25. So when this is all simplified, we get x plus 4 squared plus y plus 3 squared equal to 25, and that is the standard form equation of this circle. So let's move on to our second example. Okay, so for this example, we're given that the endpoints of the diameter of this circle are at -7, -4, and -5, 7. So in this case, they've only given us the endpoints of the diameter of this circle. But remember, to construct the standard form equation of this circle, we need the center and the radius. And in this case, neither of those things were provided. So since they gave us the endpoints of the diameter of the circle, what we can first try and do is find what the center is of this circle. So remember, if we were kind of like sketch this, we have one point at -7, -4, and the other at -5 and 7, and we basically have like a line segment going from the first point to the other point, which is representative of our diameter of the circle. So essentially, to find the center, we want to find the point in the middle of those 2 points essentially. And in order to do that, what we need to do is utilize our midpoint formula. And as a refresher, midpoint formula is going to be x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So if we were to kind of define everything, we can denote our first pair, -7, -4. The -7 would be our x1, and the -4 would be our y1. And then for the second pair, -5, 7, the -5 would be our x2, and the 7 would be our y2. And what we can do is just plug in these coordinates accordingly to our midpoint formula. So when we plug this in, it'll become -7 plus a -5 divided by 2, and then -4 plus 7 divided by 2. And when we simplify that, for the first coordinate, we have -7 plus -5, that will become -12 over 2. And then for the second one, we have -4 plus 7, that will become 3 over 2. And then -12 over 2 will simplify to -6, and then 3 over 2 will just stay 3/2 basically. And we get that our center is at -6 and 3/2. So we have the first thing that we need, the center. So the next thing that we need is our radius. And in order to find our radius, what we can do is, let's just first plug in what we have right now into our equation. So we have that our center is at -6 3/2. So what we can do is plug that -6 and 3/2 into the h and k. So that will become x minus a -6 squared plus y minus 3/2 squared equal to r squared. And when we clean that up, it'll become x plus 6 squared plus y minus 3/2 squared equal to r squared. So now what we have to do is figure out what is r. So since we are provided with 2 coordinates on the circle, right? We were given 2 pairs. What we can do is plug in one of those pairs into the x and y of this equation to help us solve for r. So it really doesn't matter which pair you plug in, you'll ultimately get the same answer. But I'm going to plug in the coordinate -5, 7. So when I plug that in, I'll plug in the -5 into the x and the 7 into the y. And that'll become -5 plus 6 squared plus 7 minus 3/2 squared equal to r squared. And when we simplify that, -5 plus 6 will become 1 squared plus, and then 7 minus 3/2 is going to be 11/2 squared. So when we keep simplifying this, 1 squared is 1, and then 11/2 squared is going to become 121 over 4 equal to r squared. And then 1 plus 121 over 4 becomes 125 over 4. And then the last thing we want to do to solve for r is just take the square root of both sides to get rid of that square from the r. And the square root of 125 over 4 is just the square root of 125 over 4. And we get r equal to the square root of 125 over 4. So now we have everything that we need for this equation. We have the center, -6 3/2, and we have our radius being the square root of 125 over 4. So now we can just plug in everything. So remember, we'll plug in the -6 to our h, we'll plug in the 3/2 into our k, and then we'll plug in the square root of 125 over 4 into our r. And then when we simplify that, x minus a -6 squared will become x plus 6 squared. Then y minus 3/2 squared will just stay as y minus 3/2 squared. And then the square root of 125 over 4 squared will just turn into 125 over 4. And we get our final answer being x plus 6 squared plus y minus 3/2 squared equal to 125 over 4. And that is the equation. So let's move on to our third example. Alright guys, so for our third example, we're given that the center of this circle is at 4, 9. And we're also given that one of the points of the circle passes through 1, 9. So luckily for us, we're given one of the details that we need for this circle, which is the center. We're given that the center is at 4, 9. But remember, in order to construct the standard form equation of a circle, we need both the center and radius. So in this case, all we need to do is find what the radius is, and then we can form the equation. So what we can do right now is just plug in what we have. We know that the center is at 4, 9. So if we were to plug everything in to the equation, we can plug in the 4 into the h and the 9 into the k. And then that'll give us x minus 4 squared plus y minus 9 squared equal to r squared. So now we need to solve for r. So in this case, they gave us a point on a circle, which is 1, 9. So what we can do is plug that point into the x and y of this equation to help us solve for r. So we'll plug in the 1 into the x and the 9 into the y, and we'll get 1 minus 4 squared plus 9 minus 9 squared equal to r squared. And then we'll just continue to simplify. So when we do 1 minus 4, that'll give us a -3 squared, and then 9 minus 9 is going to give us 0 squared equal to r squared. And then -3 squared is 9, and then 0 squared is 0 equal to r squared. And then lastly, to solve for r, we're going to take the square root of both sides, and then the square root of 9 is just going to turn into 3, and we get r being 3. So now we have our center and radius. So what we can do now is just plug in everything to help us construct the equation. So we'll plug in our center 4, 9 into the h and k, and we'll plug in the radius 3 into our r, so it'll become x minus 4 squared plus y minus 9 squared equal to 3 squared. And then when we simplify everything, that'll become x minus 4 squared plus y minus 9 squared equal to, and then 3 squared is 9. So we get our final answer being x minus 4 squared plus y minus 9 squared equal to 9, and that is the equation. So let's move on to our fourth example. Alright guys, so for our fourth example, we're given that the center of this circle is at 7, 2, and we're also given that the circle is tangent to the x-axis. So remember, to help us create our standard form equation, we need our center and radius, and fortunately for this problem, we're given our center, which is at 7, 2, but we need to find our radius still. But before we find our radius, let's figure out what the heck tangent to x-axis means. So when something is tangent to something, it means it's touching something. So when it says tangent to x-axis, it means that the circle is touching the x-axis, which also means that there's going to be a point on the x-axis of the circle. So let's go ahead and kind of roughly sketch what this circle looks like. So we know our center is at 7, 2, so we'll sketch that center point 7, 2. And we can imagine that there's going to be a point directly below the center on the x-axis, and it looks like that point's going to be at 7, 0. Okay, so if we were to kind of connect the dots and sketch the circle, you can see that our circle is touching the x-axis due to that point at 7, 0. Okay, from here we can actually use these 2 points, the center and that point on the x-axis, to help us calculate the radius, because we can see the distance between those 2 points. So we know that we have one point at 7, 0. We know the other point, which is the center, is at 7, 2. So if you see, they both have the same x coordinates, both 7. But the only thing that's different is that their y coordinates are different. One's at 2, one's at 0. So we can just calculate the difference between that. Basically, there's a difference of 2, which indicates that the distance between these points is just 2, which also indicates that the radius is going to be 2. So using this information, now we have found the radius to be 2, and now we have our center and radius, and all we need to do is just plug into our standard form equation. So we can plug in our center 7, 2, so we can plug in 7 into the h, the 2 into the k, and the radius 2 into the r, and then we can just simplify this. So x minus 7 squared will just stay x minus 7 squared, plus, and then y minus 2 squared will just stay y minus 2 squared, and then 2 squared will simplify and become 4. And we get our final equation being x minus 7 squared plus y minus 2 squared equal to 4. So let's move on to our final example. Alright guys, so for our final example, we're actually given an equation, and the equation is x squared plus y squared plus 2x minus 6y minus 6 equal to 0. So this one is a little different because this time, like I said before, we're given an equation rather some like point or some radius or some centers. So essentially we don't really need to figure out what the center and radius is, because essentially it's all hidden in this equation. And this equation is what we call the general form equation of the circle, which is kind of like the unwanted equation because we don't really use it much. So essentially what we want to do is convert this equation from general form to standard form. Now you're probably wondering how we're going to do this. And to do this, what we're going to utilize is the complete the square method. So essentially we're going to just complete the square, and when we complete the square, it'll help us get the standard form equation of this circle. Now, as a refresher, when it comes to complete the square, the first thing that we want to do is we want to move all constant terms to the right side. Now, what do I mean by constant terms? Constant terms are basically the terms are just numbers, the terms without any variables. So in this case, we have that minus 6 at the end on our left side. So what we want to do is move that minus 6 to the right side. So we're going to add 6 to both sides. And when we do that, it'll leave us with x squared plus 2x plus y squared minus 6y equal to positive 6. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to group our terms with x's and y's kind of like together. And now what do I mean by that? So essentially you see we have x squared plus y squared plus 2x minus 6y. We kind of want to rearrange it, and where it'll become x squared plus 2x plus y squared minus 6y equals 6. So as you see, we have our x groups together and our y's, but terms with y together. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to add 2 blanks to both sides. So it'll become x squared plus 2x plus blank plus y squared minus 6y plus blank equal to 6 plus blank plus blank. Now, why are we creating this blank? Like, why are we adding this? Now, the reason why we're adding this is because essentially for both of our groupings, our x terms groupings and our y terms groupings, we want to create what we call a perfect square trinomial. And the reason why we want to create this perfect square trinomial, because essentially when we factor this trinomial, it'll help us get our standard form, basically. Now, why are we doing the both sides? Because remember, what we do on one side to equation, we do the other to keep it balanced. So in that blank, we're going to take our first grouping, the x's. We're going to take the coefficient in front of our x, which is 2. We're going to divide that by 2, and we're going to square it. And we'll put that in the first blanks of our left and right side. And in our second blank, we're going to take the coefficient in front of our y, which is -6. We're going to divide that by 2 and square it. And we'll put that in the second blanks of both our left and right sides. And then when we simplify what's inside the blanks, 2 divided by 2 is 1. And then -6 divided by 2 is -3. And then the last thing we want to do is square it. So 1 squared is going to become 1, and then -3 squared is going to become 9. And it'll leave us with x squared plus 2x plus 1 plus y squared minus 6y plus 9 equal to 6 plus 1 plus 9. Now the next step that we want to do is we want to factor our trinomials for both the x's and the y's. So as you see, we have x squared plus 2x plus 1 for our x grouping, so we want to factor that. Now, if you're not really solid with factoring, I have a little shortcut you can use. So whenever you factor perfect square trinomials, for this grouping, it's going to become in the form of x plus blank squared. And what's going to go inside that blank is going to be the value that was inside like our added space before we squared it. And in this case, that value was 1. So we're going to sub in that 1 into that blank, and it'll become x plus 1 squared. And that's how we factor the x grouping. Now we're going to do the same thing for the y grouping. This time it's going to be y plus blank squared since we're dealing with y's. And it's going to be very similar to how we factor the x grouping. So the value that's going to go inside that blank is the value that we evaluated inside that added space before we squared it. And for the y's, that value was -3. So we're going to sub in -3 into that space, and it'll become y plus a -3 squared, which will clean up to become y minus 3 squared. So now when we have factored both our x grouping and y grouping, it gave us x plus 1 squared plus y minus 3 squared equal to 6 plus 1 plus 9. So we're getting very close. All we need to do now is just simplify our right side, and 6 plus 1 plus 9 is going to give us 16. And then we get our final answer being x plus 1 squared plus y minus 3 squared equals 16, and that is our standard form equation. And that pretty much wraps up this video. As you see, we went through a lot of scenarios where we're given some details regarding the circle, and we take those details to construct the standard form equation. And I tried to go over like every possible scenario. So I hope this video was helpful, guys. I hope you understand now how to construct the standard form equation of a circle, and take care.